Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Hello and welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth, now broadcast on KUNX Digital Broadcasting. I often start shows with a monologue, and I have a bit of one, but I'm going to cut right to bringing in tonight's very special guest, and then kind of have the monologue with him rather than on my own. Whitley Strieber is the author of over 40 works of both fiction and nonfiction. His books, The Wolfen, The Hunger, Communion, and The Coming Global Superstorm, as The Day After Tomorrow, were all made into feature films. His sci-fi series Alien Hunter became the Sci-Fi Channel's series Hunters. In 1985, Whitley had a close encounter of the third kind, for lack of a better phrase, which led to the writing of a truly epic bestseller. You all know it, the book Communion, which came out in 1987. It changed the way the world thinks about this enigmatic experience. When he eventually realized, that the experience could not be attributed to known facts, he began making an effort to recontact what he had called the visitors. The response has been ongoing for the past 30 years and has been chronicled in a series of books. Many people have encountered the visitors, with Whitley placing it among the most witnessed paranormal events in history. Whitley Strieber's website, unknowncountry.com, is among the largest in the world dealing with paranormal phenomena, and his podcast, Dreamland, has been produced weekly for 20 years. Whitley Strieber, it's a pleasure to have you on Meanwhile Here on Earth. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be on. And unfortunately for me, it's more than 20 years that I've been doing the show, since it started in 1998.
Considerably more than 20 years then. The reason I said I wanted to not do my monologue at the beginning of the show is kind of obvious just by the date. It's September 11th. And no matter who we are, where we were, if we were alive then, we have memories, thoughts, reflections. And I'm trying to remember, Whitley, were you still living in Manhattan in 2001?
No, I was living in San Antonio, Texas.
Okay.
And I remember the day very vividly. It started with the radio came on. It used to wake us up in the morning. And suddenly there was a bulletin that a plane, it was on NPR, had crashed into the World Trade Center. And I immediately said to Ann, oh my God, a plane's crashed into the World Trade Center. It must be some commuter airline that went off course. And I couldn't believe it would be an airliner.
Of course.
The story developed from there.
Yeah.
And, I was reflecting today on the meaning of what happened and the tremendous courage of the entire New York City Fire Department to go in there knowing they might not come out, and to go up all of those flights and flights of stairs to try to get people and save people. And the heartrending 911 calls from above the impact areas with people who were dying, and the bodies falling, it was just unbelievable. And I was reflecting, why did it happen? And the reason is really simple. it happened because the human species has got a mental defect. We're believers. We want to believe. And if you look across our history, it is a history. Violence, the history of violence has two sources. One is territory, and the other is beliefs. And sometimes they intersect, like when Islam conquered half the world,
Yes.
getting territory in order to spread beliefs. There was something my wife said that I live by, and I wish more people did, but they don't. It is, the human species is too young to have beliefs.
Oh.
Need are good questions. And what she meant was, there is no such thing as a belief that is certain. And when someone challenges our beliefs, it makes us go to fighting every time. Yeah. And you see it in politics, you see it in everything. So those are my thoughts today. And I think about 911 every year at this time. And I think about mainly about the people who were lost and the firefighters who gave their all for this. It was the single greatest act of collective heroism I have ever heard of anywhere. There probably are others, but that one stands out.
I know you've met Linda from Bud Hopkins' Witnessed book, The Abductee.
Yes, I have. I know her well.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you're aware, and I know it will be fine with Linda for me to share this story. On the morning that when the first plane hit, Linda was in the lobby of the North Tower asking at the information desk which elevator she should take up to one of the higher floors.
Never heard this.
Above the impact zone where she had a job interview. The boys were growing up. Another income would be good. She had her secretarial skills, and she and her husband, Steve, had between them two cousins and I think a niece and a nephew who worked for one of the big brokerages. And they said, you'd be great here, and set up an interview for her. Linda's highly intuitive. And when the first plane hit, imagine, it's 8:35 in the morning, whatever. There's no way that the security people in the lobby have any idea what's happening, except that the building shakes and rubble starts to fall. And Linda, dressed to the nines, becomes concerned and decides she doesn't want to be there. And she goes up to one of the security guards, a strapping fellow, and asks to leave. And he explains to her that it would be dangerous for anyone to leave because of the falling debris, and no, she is not going to leave. And she backed off. And she said within a minute or so, her intuition, what she called her little voice, said, get out now. And she walks back to him and once again asks if she can leave. This man is obviously increasingly stressed out and snaps at her to some degree. I just told you no, and I told you why. And she reaches into her purse and pulls out her, I don't know how many watt stun gun, which she nicknamed Sparky, and said, open the door or I will hurt you. And he opened the door and she left. Nobody else did. And she starts walking away. She said she had to get her shoes off because there was so much debris, and it did take months for her feet to heal up. And as she walked, knowing Linda, who is a kind spirit, she saw a man she described as very old, and she started to walk with him, helping him. She's about a block away from the North Tower now, and she said, like a force of nature, something comes up and sweeps her off her feet. It is a fully decked out New York City fireman with full mask, oxygen on his back. He doesn't say a word. He runs for a block. puts her down, and before she can even thank him, she watches him run back and run into the building. That's one of my abiding images. Also, just being at my desk in the morning at the company I worked for, and somebody coming to the corridor and saying, a plane hit one of the World Trade Center buildings. My first thought was, what kind of schmuck in a private plane was violating all of the flight rules over Manhattan?
Exactly my thought.
Exactly. And, this is crazy. This is weird. I did remember back to after World War II, when I think a DC-7 crashed into the Empire State Building and stuck.
It was a bomber.
There you go.
It was a bomber. Yeah.
Maybe a B-17, B-29, but
It was a B-17.
It stuck in, and it took some amazing photo ops. But that was what I thought of. And then, of course, when they announced the second plane had hit, there was only one thing we could think, which is
it was an intentional act.
We're under attack.
Yeah. And it's never been fully excavated, obviously. I had a very interesting experience many years before, when the towers were just going up.
Yeah.
I was in the business world then, and I was flying home from Pittsburgh from a business meeting. And in those days, it may still be true, planes would fly around the tip of Manhattan in order to land at LaGuardia. I haven't been in New York in a long time. I don't know if that flight path, I've been in New York just a couple months ago, but I haven't looked up to see if that flight path is still active. It probably is. And we were flying around the World Trade Center, and there was a guy sitting beside me, and I said to him, isn't that amazingly, it's magnificent, and they're putting it up so fast. And he said, I'd never go in it. I said, why not? He said, I'm a structural engineer by trade.
Oh my
and
God.
It is deadly. I said, what do you mean?
All the load bearing on the exterior walls.
Exactly. He said, well, a building that tall should have a bearing core as well as bearing walls, and it doesn't. And if anything ever hits that building, the whole thing will go down. And I thought to myself, my God. And then, I became a writer. And years later, sure enough, someone decides to have a party for me, a launch party in the Windows on the World restaurant.
It's a wonderful restaurant.
Oh, my God. And Annie knew the story, of course. And we'd never been in the World Trade Center for that reason.
Oh my gosh.
We were the most nervous little couple in that place that night. And then one more time, some very aggressive but sweet friends wanted to go to the top of the World Trade Center. And I said, well, why don't we go to the top of the Empire State Building? It's a much better view. But no, they wanted to go to the top of the World Trade Center. So we did it. And I was hopping to get out of there.
Oh.
I never went in it. I knew it was a death trap from what that man said.
I didn't know about the structural integrity, but I had, for me, a relationship with the building. I'm old enough to remember, as a New Yorker, the neighborhood before it was zoned and everything was torn down. I think it was something like 16 acres. It was called...
I remember it very well. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Radio Row, because it's where, since the 1920s, the largest concentration of high fidelity and radio and stereo component stores were in the city. And of course, Manhattan well, and how certain neighborhoods embody certain industries. And I remember going there as a kid, but then the buildings started to go up. And my first thought was, very boring. Look at them, two giant,
yeah, they weren't pretty.
And once they went up, though, I liked the way they were on the horizon. Plus, I lived in Chinatown for 7 years, and my big picture window looking southwest opened right onto the Manhattan Bridge and the Trade Center. It was what I woke up to every morning. Plus, I worked as a walking tour guide a lot over those years. So I was in and out of the trade centers dozens of times, and on the roof twice. The main thing I remember about being on the roof was the first time I went up there with a group of tourists. The wind was so ferocious, it tore the hats off of several of them, which went sailing off into infinity. Um, there's obviously a great deal more that we don't know about everything behind this damned event than we do know. Will it be classified for as long as, John Kennedy assassination secrets, or will there be some kind of lifting of the secrecy surrounding it? I think there are too many powerful people that may be involved that we will probably not see that, and it will go on as an abiding mystery.
Well, it's
Um,
exactly like the Kennedy assassination. Just
yeah.
yesterday, one of the, I guess, Secret Service men who
Yep.
was there
I
finally
posted the
admitted.
article this morning. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I worked for John Connolly actually at the governor's mansion. I mean, at the state capitol after he was injured, and I was one of a number of young men, and we sat down in his office, and he said there were bullets flying around all over the place in that car. And then after he died, his wife Nellie went on the Larry King show
Mm.
and said John always said there was only one bullet. And I knew it wasn't true. And I knew she knew it wasn't true. And I also knew she probably had no choice but to say it. The
I'm sure you're
Connellys,
right there.
they
I'm
had a
sure you're
rough
right.
time. He started out great as a governor, but
Yeah.
got into trouble in real estate and all kinds of things. And I'm sure she was prevailed upon to say that.
The article that we're talking about, folks, which you can find on my Facebook page right now, or just Google, new break in Kennedy assassination case. The other most important um, Secret Service agent, besides Clint, forget his last name, the one who most famous for jumping on the car and covering Mrs. Kennedy as they took off. Um, he is in his 80s now, and he has been living with a lie for decades, so he says, and he has changed the story in a way that's really rather extraordinary. The so-called magic bullet, which ricocheted through Kennedy and three different parts of John Connolly, only to fall out untouched on the stretcher of Kennedy's body at Loveland Hospital. In fact, was not on the stretcher. The Secret Service agent found it in the back seat, and just violating all protocol, put it in his pocket and walked into the hospital and then put it on the gurney, totally screwing up. I mean, first of all, it lost like 2 grams and it should have been very misshapen. Of course, it wasn't the bullet. How it got there almost seems to me like the Mohammed Atta's passport, absolutely in perfect condition, lying in the streets of New York, not far from the debris of the Trade Center. Um, we will come back to this. And this is going to be kind of a non-standard show for you, Whitley, in that a lot of my shows begin with the basic premise that I've had as a question since childhood, which was, how do the people that we know, we look up to, we admire, or we hate, or impact on our lives in public life, how do they become the people they became? So to a degree, this is a conversation interview that I hope will be fun, that I hope that so many folks who admire your work and look up to you and follow you regularly will have a better idea of how Whitley Strieber became Whitley Strieber. So let me begin by saying, I know you were born in San Antonio, but can you tell us a bit about your parents for starters?
Well, yeah, sure. My father was, by the time I was in my like 10 or so, he would become pretty active politically. His brother-in-law was Attorney General of Texas.
Oh my.
And so there was a lot of politics going on. Many people, Lyndon Johnson would come over to the house. He was still a congressman then, and a lot of so that there was a lot of politics in the house, and there would be conversations out in the backyard in the evenings where, they'd sit around smoking and drinking and talking politics, and a lot of people who became quite famous. Ralph Yarborough would show up, John Connolly, um, and I became John Connolly's youth campaign manager when he ran for governor.
Gosh.
And I also worked for Ralph, Smiling Ralph. He was, in those days, there was only really one political party in Texas, the Democratic Party, and most of it was very conservative, but it had a strong liberal wing as well.
Yeah.
And Dad being he was with all sides, and Governor Allen Shivers was a good friend, and he was the friend of the governor in the 50s, and he was very. I remember most of these people as being very affable and fun. And when I was 13, my dad sent me up to Washington by myself with a friend, just the two of us. We took I believe we took the train up and a bus back, or the other way around, all the way from San Antonio. Just two little boys.
Wow.
And it never happened now, but it was considered perfectly okay then.
Yeah.
And Ralph Yarborough took us in hand when we got there, and we had lunch with him and Everett Dirksen.
Oh my gosh! Speaker of the House.
Yeah, no, he was. I believe they were both senators at the time, as I recall. I could be wrong about that.
He went on to. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was they called him Senator Dirksen, and they were polar opposites politically, but they were happy to sit down together and have a lunch and joke with each other, and that's all gone now. And then Ralph Yarborough let me drive the underground train that went between the Senate office building and the Capitol, which was incredibly cool. And
oh my gosh,
he inspired me about the environment, and told me how he had created the Padre Isles National Seashore, which is to this day a perfectly beautiful natural seashore. And then just north of it, there are some lovely hotels and things, but the seashore is preserved, and it's great. So all of that was kind of in my childhood, and there were other darker things too, but that I remember very fondly.
Let's go back a bit before this. You not only went on to become a writer, but a distinguished, successful, and let me say famous writer. Were you much of a reader as a kid, or was that something that came later? I'm always curious.
I figured out how to read when I was about 4.
Whoa.
And I just figured it out, and I started reading like crazy and having such fun doing it. I just loved reading, and I was reading all kinds of things. And then when I went into first grade, suddenly I had to read Dick and Jane.
Oh God.
Which was, I had to pretend that I didn't know how to read, or I would fail first grade. And so, and the nuns were very sweet, but they didn't understand that. And so I was a very good reader of Dick and Jane, and also Time magazine. My two big. And then when I was about 12 or 11, I believe, I found the New Yorker, and that really, then I began to read short stories, and people like John Cheever and J.D. Salinger were publishing in the New Yorker in those days. And I began to understand what writing was and the power it had.
Yeah.
And the sheer joy it brought you to read. I became a writer sometime in there. I was always wanted to be a writer from the age of 6. My ambition was to be a writer.
Um, the New Yorker is still my favorite magazine, and for some of the reasons that you've just laid out. And since the 1920s, it's given some of our greatest writers their first big breaks or continuing venue for newer works. Um, were you much of a moviegoer? And if so, or if not, did you go with your parents or on your own or with friends? Also, did you have any siblings?
Yeah, I had a sister, and then when I was 11, a brother came along. My brother and I are still extremely close. We talk at least 3 or 4 times a day. He's also my attorney.
Great.
So uh, we, yeah, we had, and I had, uh, my sister has passed on, and when we were teenagers, or when we were kids, we were very close. But then the teenage years came along, and we weren't so close anymore all of a sudden. And as you may imagine, I mean, I was 18 months younger than her, and as a little devil, I warded her to death, especially when she went to started dating. And when one of her first dates with a boy in a car, I had the girls in those days wore many petticoats under their skirts.
Crinolines.
Well, they weren't crinoline, I don't think. That was
Okay.
too fire. That was too. They were probably some anyway. But there used to be these beetles in the area called June bugs, which had very little claws on their legs, and they were
I don't
very
like where this is going already. Continue on.
clingy. And as she was rushing out the front door, I stuck a handful of June bugs up under the back of her petticoats and
Of course.
held it, and then all the June bugs got into the petticoats, and off she went. Uh, uh, and I thought to myself, thinking to myself, am I going to get in trouble or not? I wonder, because she'll feel them crawling around in the movie and panic and completely, because she hated bugs. She was not a bug fan at all. And so they come back, and now they're sitting down at the front of the walk, and there's a big hedge down there, and Dad is, of course, going from window to window, just peering out, and Mother's saying, if you don't want her to date, don't let her date, Carl. But you have decided we're trusting her. Now don't go down there. Don't embarrass her. Suddenly, screaming, unearthly screaming erupts from the car. Dad goes barreling out the front door. The boy jumps out of the car and runs off down the street. Mother runs down. I'm up in my second floor window watching all of this, not
Knowing
yet fully understanding what I'm going to see. Gets Patricia, my sister, out of the car, gets her into the front yard. It's very windy. She's clutching herself. Mother's pulling off petticoats. They're flying around the front yard. And all of a sudden, I hear my mother yell to my father, "It wasn't him, Carl. She's got June bugs in her underpants." And I just turned around and buried my face in my pillow. And I was out of control laughing. And I just hoped to God they didn't come up to see if I was responsible in any way, because I couldn't control it. And they didn't. They never thought of me as being the culprit. They just thought it was some kind of bizarre accident.
is
And
this
the
the
next,
first time that you have admitted this in the public realm, Whitley?
probably, I don't know. But my sister, was not fooled. She assumed that anything like that happened, no matter how improbable, it had to have something to do with me. And so a couple of nights later, we lived in the upstairs, the big house, and downstairs there was more rooms, and then a wing that my parents were in. And my parents, you couldn't hear anything in the upstairs that the intercom was turned off, and it was easy enough to turn it off from the upstairs. And suddenly she had a slumber party, and the girls came bursting into my room and dragged me into the bathroom, where they had made a bath full of ice and ice water, and held me down in this ice water. It was awful. So
Well,
I got paid back, even though the parents never understood what happened.
I think I'd rather have an ice bath than June bugs in my underwear, all things considered.
It was a pretty fun childhood, I have to tell you. It had its dark side early on, but by the time these years had come, it was long gone.
It sounds to me like me. You grew up with one of three kids in a relatively happy family with good parents, some wonderful childhood memories, but a real divergence for you and I would have been that you were a kid growing up in Texas. I was a kid growing up in New York. And all of a sudden we're shaken from childhood, November 22nd, 1963, almost 60 years ago. Can you talk about what that day was like for you?
1963. Oh, the Kennedy assassination. Sure. I sure will. I was at school at St. John's College in Maryland. And I guess I was probably walking across the campus, and suddenly someone said, Kennedy's been shot. And I thought, oh, they couldn't kill the president. And the next thing I knew, he was dead.
In Dallas.
Well, there was a very disturbing thing that happened beforehand. A couple of days before. Now, remember, my dad's brother-in-law at this point is, I believe, chairman of the Democratic Party of Texas. In any case, he has something to do with the motorcade and everything. He's involved. I know that. And Dad suddenly calls me on, I guess it was a couple days before, and says, I want you to go down to be with your uncle and aunt in Washington. I had an uncle and aunt who they had just left the State Department. He'd been an undersecretary of state, as I recall.
Wow.
And he'd been an admiral in the Navy. And when Eisenhower's term ended, he was asked if he wanted to stay on, and he was a Republican, so he didn't. So he was had started working as a lobbyist. And I said to Dad, but I have a seminar. I can't go down, just leave school and go to Washington. And Dad says, will you, for once, without questioning me, simply do something I ask you to? And I said, okay. But of course I didn't go. And because there was no reason to. Right. And then this happened. And I was terrified because I thought to myself, of course, Daddy must have known something about this. And I didn't go home for Thanksgiving. I just didn't want to. But then I went home for Christmas, and at some point, Daddy and I were together, and I said, Daddy, how did you know Kennedy was going to be assassinated? And he looked at me like I was insane and said, I didn't know that. And I said, but you called me. And he said, Whitley, we asked Kennedy to ride through Dallas in a covered car, and he refused. And he was informed that it was very dangerous to do it that other way. And when I heard he was not going to accept a covered car, I told you to get to Washington because I was afraid for our country.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that extraordinary?
I've never heard an account like that from anybody I've even remotely known.
And of course, I've asked around, and people all say, "Oh no, a car was." He didn't get an opportunity to have a covered car, and I don't know what's true and what's not true, but I do know there are quite a few people who wanted Kennedy dead.
Oh yes.
I think LBJ might have been one of them because LBJ at the time was hooked up with a con man called Billy Saul Estes, who had gotten in trouble because he had sold a lot of vegetable oil or some kind of oil that was in tanks all over South Texas, West Texas, only they were empty. And that's always a problem. And I heard stories even in those days that Robert Kennedy was going to charge LBJ with a crime, and he was going to be taken off the ticket. Now, true or not, I don't know. I haven't seen anything about it. I've read all of Robert Caro's books, which are very exhaustive. And to me, it just remains a possibility, a rumor. Knowing the Johnsons, though, I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was true. In any case, then there was Louis Swearingen, who ran the group at No Name Key, and it was Kennedy's decision that led to these people all being captured and ending up on the Isle of Pines. So he was certainly very angry at Kennedy. Sam Giancana, Kennedy had seduced his girlfriend, Judith Exner, on
Campbell, yes,
in order to thumb his nose at the mafia that
Not
had
a good idea.
him elected.
Not a good idea.
Because they had juiced the ballot box in Chicago and gotten him Illinois.
Yep.
And LBJ had gotten him Texas. And both of these men, I mean, so they had reasons too. Allen Dulles was being pushed out of the CIA.
Yes.
And he was running the CIA from his backyard on the phone. And Kennedy was getting rid of him. So there was that motive. And then there was also this story, which I've followed up years ago with Stanton Friedman, that Kennedy wanted to out the whole UFO thing. And at one point, Marilyn Monroe had called a friend in Mexico and told this friend that one of the Kennedys, I believe it might have been Bobby, not JFK, had told her the most incredible thing about flying saucers, that is going to change the world. And then she, so there might have been some kind of motive inside the deep state, the secret government. So you get to the point where, the only people who didn't have a motive to kill Kennedy were a couple of nuns in Peoria. And you don't know who might have been involved in it. But it certainly wasn't a single bullet. There's no question of that. It never has been. And there's a damn good reason, I suspect, that the one thing they won't release are the x-rays of Kennedy's head.
It would show conclusively that one bullet was not involved and two different directions were.
Well, it would also show that people like Allen Dulles were lying through their teeth when they described the condition of the corpse.
Yeah. You bring up so many thoughts. In 92, I was invited to give a talk by Dallas Mufon, and I negotiated it for that weekend of the anniversary, knowing that there was a ceremony and that there was a conference in town. I think, I thought I would get some sense of completion, an overused word that often means nothing, if I went there and walked the walk myself. And I had stayed at a hotel with my then co-author. That would have been on that last leg of the motorcade before the cars turned right toward the Texas Book Repository. And we walked those few blocks after breakfast. That square well, but it had grown so big in my imagination over the years that I thought for a moment I was looking at like a half-scale Disney reproduction. Every year, the distance from the vehicle to the grassy knoll had grown longer and longer and longer, and all of a sudden there they were. I visited.
It's not big.
It's not at all.
No, it's a little place. It's the whole little area. It's not big.
Yeah, I visited every relevant location, including where Oswald and his wife Marina lived, where J.D. Tippit was shot, went down into the driveway of the old former police department where Ruby had shot Oswald, went to the location of the old Carousel Club, went to the museum in the book repository. I left there more angry than I had been in years. It was just all so infuriating that the lie was so apparent, even to a layperson who had some idea of what had gone down. For you as a Texan, and a proud one, I think, did this leave any lasting residual thoughts in your mind? Did it have anything to do with scary scenarios that may have affected your ideas when you became a writer? This was real life terror. This wasn't something from the imagination that you had generated, but it produced results in people all around the world that, writers with some dark humor can only dream of eliciting from readers.
Well, I was still struggling to be I was writing short stories then and taking writing courses in school. And I would soon leave St. John's College to move to University of Texas on the theory that I wanted to be at a party school, because St. John's was a great books college and very serious, and I like to have fun. I still do. I mean, I always like to have fun. So I basically moved to a party school I knew very well, having gone to many parties there when I was a teenager. And tell you a funny story about one of those too, if you got time. Anyway,
We do.
Well, anyway, so I moved to the University of Texas, and I was mainly interested in trying to be a writer then, and I was very fixated on that. But I was not exposed to things like conspiracy theories. Really, nobody was in those days.
Sure.
But when I went to the university, I joined the Daily Texan, the daily newspaper, and I was one of the junior editors. I forget what my title was, and I'd been a copy boy at the San Antonio Express, and so I loved the whole newspaper shtick and business.
Yeah.
And I was there when the Warren Commission thing came through, and Charmaine Marsh, the head of the Daily Texan, felt that the paper should publish the whole Warren report as a matter of record.
Wow.
And so, but the problem was our faculty advisor thought this was essentially insane. And I ended up between the two of them, with Charmaine saying, "Do the whole thing," and the faculty advisor saying, "Don't tell Charmaine, but just cut it down to the size that I'm telling you to cut it down to." And fortunately, she didn't actually read it any more than anyone else did, but I did read it.
Oh my gosh.
And I guess I could taste the lies somehow. Something was very wrong. And then there was a play about Lyndon being responsible, and of course that got my back up, because he was, he wasn't family. We weren't that close. I mean, I didn't hang out with the girls or anything, but they knew me, and they certainly knew my dad and mom. So I felt a sense of loyalty there on the one hand. On the other hand, if it had been his fault, if he had done it somehow, and I knew a lot about the Texas Mafia, which is, well, let's put it this way. The Italian Mafia from Nevada sent a guy down to San Antonio back in the 50s to take over the beer distribution business.
Bad decision?
He returned to wherever it was, Vegas or wherever he'd been sent, rapidly, just shortly thereafter. only he wasn't in the same condition he had been. He was
Missing.
now luggage. He was in a steamer trunk, or his remains were. And I think that was intended to make it clear to the other mafia that Texas had its own mafia, and it was intimately integrated into politics. And I lived in that world. So I just basically decided, I'm a kid. I don't know what's going on here. I'm going to have a lot of fun here at the University of Texas. And let me put it this way. I can no longer stand even the smell of liquor like Four Roses and Canadian Club. I can't handle the cheap liquors at all. And the reason is we used to have something there called a Hairy Buffalo, where everyone would come and pour any kind of liquor they happened to bring into a big bucket. And we would all drink that until we were completely tired and had to be dragged to our fraternity houses and sorority houses.
Saying, I will never drink again. Please, God, just kill me now.
No, I would never drink again either. I mean, I haven't been drunk since I was about 20, 21, maybe. I don't know. No, I'm past that.
But that's how you learn that this is not something I want to do.
Well, yeah, I don't like to be sick and miserable. And I woke up one afternoon at 3:00 in the afternoon, crunched up on a love seat in the apartment of some co-eds, wearing nothing but my underpants, still drunk and also hungover. And I thought, this is over. I can't live like this. I'm not going to ever get drunk again, and I haven't.
Whitley, at this point in your life, are you still writing short stories or thinking, I need to study more or be out in the world and have some adventures, or I have my first major project lined up? When did you zone in on what became your first novel?
Well, I met a certain woman called Ann Strieber. And she said to me over our first lunch, she said, what's your ambition in life? What do you want to do? Because she knew I didn't want to be a media planner at Benton and Bowles or wherever I was advertising. And she certainly didn't want to be a receptionist, which is where she was. And I said, I want to be a writer. And she said, that's great. And said no more. But she took it to heart. And in that moment, I know she decided, I'm going to make him a writer. I'm going to make him a writer. I'm going to help him fulfill his ambition. That's my ambition now. And we went on our first date. We talked on the phone a lot, and we had another second lunch, and then we went on our first date, which was to the producers.
Wonderful.
So we were having this wonderful time in this hilarious movie.
What a movie.
And we went back to my apartment, which was 2 rooms, and it was just a total disaster. I couldn't do anything. That the superintendent had pitied me and gotten an old bed and an old couch out of the basement and put them in the apartment for me. So it was just a horror show. And not only that, there was a friend staying with me from San Antonio, one of my oldest friends. But we went just berserk. I mean, it was my first time with a girl. And I never would ask Anne a question like, was it your first time? It's not my business. But we went into the bedroom to talk, as we put it, and closed the door. And we just went for it immediately. We couldn't stop ourselves. And, we didn't get married until 6 months later, but we were married on that night for sure. I mean, I was the type of boy and she was the type of girl, as you made love, you were married to that person. And so she set out to make me a writer. She went back to school. She got a master's in English literature, and she became my editor. And she was a hard editor. And I wrote failed novel after failed novel. None of them got picked up. And then I had the inspiration for The Wolfen, and that was the beginning.
That was the first book of yours I read because I had seen the movie, and I love reading, but I'm also something of a movie maniac. And Albert Finney, one of the finest actors to go into film, British actor, but could play anything. He made that character and that story come alive. And being a New Yorker, I knew Central Park really well. And from that time on, you were on my radar as a writer. What was, again, to write a first book and then have it optioned for a film, and then have the option picked up, and then have an incredibly respected, internationally respected actor to play the lead part and to be paid for it all? That must have been an absolutely extraordinary experience to bring you into the world of professional writers and more.
Yeah, it was amazing. I was even buttonholed by Elaine of Elaine's, and until I wrote Communion, we used to go to Elaine's occasionally, but once Communion came out, that was all over.
Yeah.
No more Elaine's. Whitley, he turned out to be completely insane. Well, I'll tell you a wonderful story about the making of that film.
Please.
We didn't go down too much. They were in downtown Manhattan quite a bit, and we went down one evening because Finney was there, and I had asked the producer if I could meet him. The director wouldn't let me get near him. And I understand that. He's making his movie. Last thing he wants is the novelist snooping around. So I didn't press that, but the producer was very sweet. And so I go down and he says, Finney's sitting over there. Go say hello. And Finney's sitting on a bench, and we're in an outdoor setting. The set's on a street corner. And I go over and I say, hello, Mr. Finney. I'm the writer. I'm the novelist, Whitley Strieber. And he just sits there, stares off into space. And I think to myself, I say, excuse me. And there's just nothing. Nothing. I mean, it's not like he doesn't see me. It's like, not that I'm not there, but that he's not there. So I go back to the producer. I said, he looks like he's out cold. What's going on? He said, oh, he's dead drunk. I said, dead drunk? What is going to happen? How can because he was in between takes. And he says, just watch. It's fascinating.
He's a pro.
And here's what happens. The PA says, Mr. Finney, we're ready for you in the shot. And he stands up, walks into the shot, does 2 takes perfectly, in character, in voice, everything. Lines are perfect, everything. Comes back, pulls a bottle of, speaking of cheap liquor, 4 Roses or something like that, out of a pint, sucks it for a while, puts it back, and he's back like this again. It was astonishing. And, the actor, the character, wasn't drinking. Albert Finney was drinking, but not the character. So the character was fine. Albert Finney was drunk as a skunk, but the character was perfectly fine. It's wild.
That's kind of hair-raising.
It was weird. It was wonderfully fascinating. I told Anne, without telling her that he was drunk, I told her, you go over and try, and she wouldn't do it. She suspected something. She knew me too well by that time.
we are coming up to our on the hour break. I knew our time would fly, but I didn't realize it would be this fast. When we come back, we will pick up where we left off. This is Peter Robbins. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. My very special guest tonight is Whitley Strieber. Be back in 4. Stay with us.
It's almost here, ladies and gentlemen. The UNX Network Year 2 anniversary at XCon 2023. XCon is being held this year from October the 30th to November 1st at the beautiful Oasis Hotel and Conference Center in Springfield, Missouri. Top speakers include host of America Unearthed, Scott Walter, plus Haley Ramsey, Sev Tak, UNX's very own Maureen Richmond and Dan Terry, Mindy Toutfest, Harriet McFeely, Forrest Crawford, and many more. And they're all coming to deliver new information on topics like UFOs, alien encounters, cryptids and ancient secrets, and real hauntings from the afterlife. Join us for the film premiere of A Haunting in Blue Hill. And don't miss the Mad Hatter Paranormal Halloween Bash, Banquet, and Costume Contest on All Hallows Eve, October 31st. So join us as we close out the 2023 conference season. Info and tickets are available now at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com, and we'll see you there.
And we are back. Meanwhile, Here on Earth is the show. Peter Robbins, that's me, your host. And our guest, Whitley Strieber, is missing in action. And there he is, as if by wizardry. Back again. Whitley, where we left off was with The Wolfen. What was the next book that you wrote? And can you tell us, this is an amazing moment for a writer. Your first book is a bestseller. It's a hit. It becomes a movie. How do you follow it? How that divining rod that artists have, that we wait to dip and follow the direction it goes in and follow our passion and create the next work that we're going to do. What process took over after that to bring you to your second novel?
Well, I had a brilliant editor, Jim Landis at William Morrow and Company. And Jim and I sat down and talked about this. And he said, what you've done here is you have redefined the werewolf.
True.
Go home and redefine the vampire. And so I did. And I made the vampire not a supernatural being, but a different species that preys on human beings. And I worked with that, did an entire novel. And this was in the days of the typewriter, by the way.
Oh, yes.
It was slower. And Jim read it. I read it. Anne read it, of course. Anne read it first. And everyone was too polite about it. They were too polite. Jim was excited. We're going to publish it. It's, and I got a nice offer for it and everything. And Anne was excited. And one night I said, "You're not excited?" She said, "I wonder why not." And then I said to myself, I've written a vampire as a man, but it's actually a woman. And I realized that the vampire was a woman. And I thought to myself, I'm going to change this vampire into a woman and probably piss Anne off. So I didn't tell her. And I did the whole novel again. And by this time, Jim had taken a leave of absence because he was so exhausted by all these drafts and everything. And another editor was filling in for him. And I give the novel to Anne, and she starts reading it one afternoon. And the silence falls. And I realize, is she furious? So furious she can't move, or is she absorbed? And I see the pages are going down and down. And afterwards she says, "Whitley, it's brilliant. It's wonderful." I said, "Why has it changed so much?" He said, "Because you are in love, and you're in love with Miriam. You weren't in love with Michael or whatever his name was. You're in love with Miriam." And only then did the relationship with the man, come into it. The female who gets involved with her it was only originally a male vampire and a woman that he seduced and brought into the world. That was eventually the Susan Sarandon character.
That's right.
I retained her, but added a man, and it turned out to be what it's on. It's one of a very, very popular novel. It's been a beloved novel for many years.
Yes.
So that was how it all happened. Basically with Anne, and the faint praise from Anne and Jim made me make it a good book.
When I was younger and my aim was to be a painter and studying painting at Visual Arts in New York, one thing that one could always say about the work that you were involved in at that moment, no matter what else, was that in some way it had come from an embracing of or resistance to aspects of the previous thing you had painted. And no question about it, that the painting you did after it would in some way be related to it. Was your third novel something that followed that rule, or a whole different happenstance?
I think I sort of fell off the next few novels, to my mind, aren't as good as The Wolfen and the Hunger, which are both, in my opinion, classics. And the next really good novel I write is probably War Day. But then between that, there's the novel Black Magic, and then there is the novel. It's called. I called it Father Night, but the editors wanted to call it Unholy Fire, and Jim and I split up, and it wasn't as. Those three novels are kind of a dark period in my life. I got very ill. I had a terrific case of appendicitis that turned gangrenous, and
Oh God,
nearly died. And I was weak, and I had a brand new baby in the house, and it was just not a good time.
Yeah.
And so those three books, Black Magic, The Night Church, and Unholy Fire, are the weakest of my production in that period, I think. Although of them all, I think that the most bizarre one is probably Black Magic, because it caused me a lot of trouble. Without knowing it, I knew nothing about remote viewing. I stepped on, somehow or another got involved. There was an actual Hal Puthoff and Russ Harg's remote viewing program was underway, and it was at the time extremely secret. And then here comes this novel. It's got all this remote viewing in it. But what was so bizarre about it was that my descriptions of the secret academic or scientific city in Russia were incredibly uncannily accurate.
Oh my gosh.
In other words, I actually, without knowing anything about remote viewing, remote viewed this community in detail. Amazing. And then got tangled up with these strange people who we eventually ascertained were intelligence agencies.
No doubt.
And
wondering how you came into this information.
Yeah, well, that's happened to me a number of times in my life. That was the least of them. The worst was in the book Majestic, where I had gotten a lot of information from General Arthur Exon and from my Uncle Mickey about what really went on. And unwittingly at the time, I understand how it works now. The visitors will come in and, if you don't know what you're doing, you don't notice when the thoughts that come into your mind aren't yours. And so Majestic's full of all kinds of official secrets. I still don't know what they are because I don't have a security clearance. But this Senate Intelligence Committee went berserk, and their chief counsel. I'm going to block on his name for a second. Dick D'Amato got in touch with me, and they started asking me all kinds of questions, and I was threatened with a subpoena, which seemed pretty ominous to me, and trying to find out where I'd gotten all this information. And since I didn't know what was secret and what wasn't, I couldn't really answer the question, except I was very concerned about General Exon and my uncle. My uncle was, of course, my uncle, and General Exon was a close family friend, and they'd been in the Roswell incident at Air Materiel in Wright Field. General Exon had held one of the bodies in his arms, for God's sakes. And General Twining was the head of the thing, and he'd had one of these creatures in his office while it was alive. And, I knew all this stuff, and what I didn't know was that these were the biggest secrets on Earth.
Exactly.
And not only that, the secrecy, locomotion does not start with us. It starts with the visitors. They are the architects of the secrecy. And in my new book, I show exactly how they did it. They didn't need to tell anybody anything. They didn't need to sit down across a table from some high panjandrum in the government and say, you keep this secret or we'll blow up your planet with a Death Star. None of that. They did it, though. It's their doing. And what was going on behind the scenes basically was that General Twining had been converted to Catholicism by Padre Pio, of all people, the famous levitating saint in Italy in 1946, just before he came back to the United States to his Air Materiel assignment. And so here you had this guy who was an absolutely intense Catholic, because I know a lot of people who've converted. I was a Catholic myself for most of my life, still am to a degree. I mean, you never cease to be a Catholic. You say you're a lapsed Catholic, but you don't say I'm no longer a Catholic. There's no such thing. Anyone who says that was never a Catholic in the first place. Anyway, here he is. And remember, back then, 1946, 47, and all this started in 1945, by the way, and was amped up in 46 when these mysterious balls of light started shooting down V2 missiles we were testing at White Sands. So this was definitely on the radar. No one knew what the hell was going on. But the idea of aliens from another planet wasn't a meme. It wasn't something we thought about.
That's right.
We didn't even know the size of the universe in those days.
Yeah.
People seriously thought there might be other people on places like Mars and Venus.
That's right.
Dr. Lowell, the great astronomer, had
canals.
Theorized that there were canals on Mars. Yeah. Exactly. And so, we were really, and then these things show up and word comes down from above General Twining that the fear is that this may be a patrol, a forward air patrol of some kind from some ungodly source nobody knows. Right. And of course, then the brief exchange that General Twining has, and I'm talking about this, I don't give a damn anymore, has with this thing which says we're not interested in human beings. He comes away feeling like this is a demon. That it talks to him in his head. I've had this experience with the visitors, and it ain't easy. When they get into your head, you have to be prepared, because all of a sudden, someone is looking at you from places inside yourself that you do not go, because the things that interest them, of course, are the things that you don't want to face, because, you had illicit sex when you were 14, or you desire someone you shouldn't desire, or anything, you stole something, you were party to an accident that was really almost, in my mind, I'm just making these things up as I go along, but any kind of thing like that makes you uneasy attracts them like a moth to a flame inside your mind. And this man, God knows what was in his mind. He was a ferocious death and everything. What was in his mind? He was so distraught about himself and his life that he goes to one of the great mystical Catholics of the age and asks for his advice, and ends up being converted to Catholicism by him. And then he comes and has an experience with someone who goes into his mind to all of his dark places. And of course he thought they were demons. And from that day to this, I don't think there's been a single general in command at Air Materiel who has not been a major figure in one religious organization or another. And I think that this whole thing, as far as the Air Force is concerned, is about demons.
Whitley.
It's not about demons. It's just about really weird beings.
A very fundamentalist approach, which is not necessarily a healthy thing. Thinking about the Twinings that ufologists thinking about, who goes on to become head of the Air Force.
Right.
The objects reported are something real and not visionary or fictitious, a favorite quote, but that is just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
At this point, you're emerging as a writer of non-standard subjects. Let's call them paranormal, ghosty, strange, unnerving. Did you find that you had intended to do that, or it was just, you woke up one morning in a way and said,
well, look,
this is the way I'm writing and what I'm writing about?
This was in me. I just didn't know it. The Wolfen, they're gray. They have huge piercing eyes. They're highly intelligent. They are very hidden, subtle predators who cull the herd of mankind so carefully nobody even notices that they're there. What is that? That's the Greys. I was writing a book about the Greys without knowing it. Then the blondes come along, tall, sinister, and there are other blondes. Let me put it this way: it's not all good guys. very appealing, very kind and friendly, but basically also after something here that is part of our blood and sinew. And so the next book is about the blondes. Then I go on down the road. I sort of sputter for a while in this other kind of situation where I unwittingly write a book that's apparently a masterpiece of remote viewing. So I've been led to suspect. And then a couple of other books, one of which is a kind of conspiracy theory book about a church within the church and a dark church within the church. And then I write a book about the fairy folk called Cat Magic, which is, again, part of this whole world of the visitors. Because if you look in the old lullabies, come down, bonny angels, go away, peery fairies, go away from our little room. The peery fairies, of course, are the big black eyes. So yeah, I'm entwined in this without knowing it. It's my part of my life. And what I've forgotten at this point in my life is it was very prominent in my childhood too.
And that's my next question. Most people who know your work and know who you are know about the events or something, if they haven't read Communion, in which case it's an abstract, but that your family, friends had a series of completely unnerving events in your place in upstate New York. This would have been about 1985. But looking back now, when do you think the visitors started to interact with you in your life?
Well, back in the summer of 1952,
Whoa.
my parents were apparently approached by some Air Force officers who proposed that I be put into a special program
Oh
for
gosh.
super bright children.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I don't have any memory of this. I do have very confused memories of something awful happening, and that happened in August. In October, my immune system had collapsed, and I had to be taken out of school and isolated. I ended up at a military hospital nearby called Brick General Hospital, being a little tiny boy being given shots of gamma globulin,
Good
and
Lord.
with having to stay overnight a couple times without my mama, and it was very hard for me. But and then sent home and isolated, where I couldn't go to school until the next January came along. And my mother kept that that report card with absent, absent, absent for years. And then my
Oh,
sister got a hold of it and disappeared because she had I don't know, she had a bug in her ear about hiding this stuff. So anyway, the reason I know it happened was a man who is to now my best friend. We didn't know each other well as children, is also in this intelligence thing. I mean, there was IQ tests or whatever it was.
yeah.
And he was approached, but he was 2 years older than me and more mature. And he was in the living room when the Air Force officers made the pitch for this thing, for them to come to this thing at Randolph Air Force Base. And the parents were told it would involve the use of something called a Skinner box. And they declined because they knew what a Skinner box was, which I'm sure my parents did not. And I do remember being put into a dark room and all this noise and being very scared, very scared.
Wow.
And my sister and a boy from across the street were involved too. They were sort of taken along to, I don't know why, but neither one of them worked out. The boy grew up and was still living in his family home when he died at the age of 53 of an overdose of cortisone
Oh God.
given to him by the VA. And my sister just never really had a successful life, and they were both scarred. And I think this might have been very well part of it. But I'm a tough bird, and yeah, I was scarred. But then the visitors showed up in my life, and I don't think they showed up in their lives. And I was sustained by their presence in my life all through my childhood. It was my secret, my wonderful secret. And my dad was in on it, but if he was alive today and I asked him, I don't know if he would remember, because people don't remember. They're capable of getting people to do all kinds of things and not remember it.
You bet.
But when it ended, as I reached puberty, I can remember going into the crawl space behind the clothes hamper in the bathroom looking for them, because they weren't there anymore, and I really, really missed them. And I used to be able to go up on the top roof of the house in the night and go up in the air. Oh my God. And then suddenly I couldn't anymore. It stopped happening. And all of my nightlife, my nighttime things. I wrote a book called The Secret School about this.
Yes.
But I'm not sure how, I mean, I would never say it's an accurate story, because it's an attempt to, a child who can never understand anything. I mean, an adult couldn't have understood what was going on. So it's an attempt to at least say something strange happened in my childhood. And I know that to be the case. So, but it was exactly. So anyway, the cosmic egg was cracked by that experience, and the visitors came in through the crack.
We're now, let's say, in the mid-1980s, and this series of events has occurred at your upstate vacation home, we'll call it.
Yeah.
And these things disturb you deeply, so much so that you connect with somebody who is doing work around this wild allegation that beings are interacting with human beings, taking them, returning them. How did you first meet Bud Hopkins?
Well, what happened was I had this bizarre experience, and I was totally strung out. Yeah. I thought I was going insane, because by that time, anything that had occurred in my childhood was completely buried and forgotten. I couldn't remember any of that.
Yep.
And I woke up one morning with these bizarre, confused memories. At first, I thought an owl had gotten into the house, and then over the next few days, I began to be very uncomfortable because I'd been raped, and I was struggling with a lot of pain that I couldn't figure out. Why did I feel like this?
Yeah.
And over the next few days or weeks, more and more weird stuff came in, and I thought I was going insane. And I tried to get Anne to leave and everything. I had big fights with her, trying to get her to divorce me, because I thought I was going to be a psychotic in a home, and she wouldn't be able to divorce me then. She wouldn't have any source of income either. So it was awful, terrible time. Finally, I went to the doctor, and one of the things he said after examining me was, "Whitley, you've been raped. You understand that you've been," no, he didn't say rape. He said, "You have a rectal injury." And that was very disturbing, because I remembered something being put into my rectum. And I remember that it caused an erection. It was an electrostimulator, they're called. They still use them in animal husbandry, but in those days they were also used with human beings, because it was before Viagra or anything like that. And it stimulates the nerve that causes an erection. And you can even hear me in my hypnosis session saying, "How did that happen?" I mean, I had an erection all of a sudden in a situation where you'd think that would be very unlikely, to say the least. And I came to the end of my rope. I couldn't explain it any other way, that it had really happened. But what the hell was it? I got the Criminal Investigation Division in New York State involved. They couldn't help me because there was no evidence to go on, no place to start. And I started reading this book that my brother had sent me called Science and the UFOs. And in the back of the book, there's a description of what seemed to me like similar to what happened to me, and vaguely similar. And a researcher named Bud Hopkins. And that began one of the most wonderful and tragic relationships of my life, because Bud saved my life.
Yeah.
I was going down the tubes, boy, until Bud came along, and this big, kind man with a fabulous sense of humor suddenly was saying it's okay to think that this was indeed, as I used to say, little men take me aboard a flying saucer.
Yes.
And Anne was so supportive, because I finally, I told my buddy Timothy Greenfield Saunders the story. He was the first person I told before Bud or anybody. And I said, I don't know how to tell Anne. I didn't tell him that we'd been fighting, and I was afraid that my hints that we should have a divorce, if I told her this, would turn out to be, yeah, let's have a divorce. So I finally told Anne, and she looks at me and she says, "Oh, thank God.
It makes sense now.
I don't have to get a divorce." And I thought to myself, boy, I married the right guy.
Just what I was thinking.
And we just laughed in each other's faces and threw ourselves into each other's arms, and the rest is that kind of history.
Now I'm going to jump in here and tell you part of a story about this period of time that you were only peripherally aware of. By 1985, 86, Bud and I have been friends for 10 years, and I was working as his assistant, as you know. Over the years, my responsibilities expanded from answering the phone to filing to doing intake interviews to spending time with abductees. I came crashing into the work with a recovered memory of my own UFO sighting as a child, but that was what caused my sister Helen to talk to me about her abduction-related memories at a time when abduction research hadn't quite begun yet. And ultimately, I was very proud to be a confidant. People share things with you that will never go beyond you. And on one afternoon, he said, "I have to tell you something. Are you aware of a writer named Whitley Strieber?" I said, "Sure." And first thing I mentioned was Wolfen, the movie and the book. And he said, "This has to stay between us." And he told me that you had come to him, that you were really in very rough shape, that he had helped you find a therapist and had started working with you in recovering memories. Well, for me, my first thought was, holy shit, this is a very famous writer. And we haven't had one of them come forward and describe the kind of incidents in his life that we were involved in working around. I know that at a certain point, he encouraged you, I'm guessing that Anne probably did too, to extricate this material, to get it out of you. And for a writer, what's more natural than writing it? And that it had progressed to the point where you were working on a book. Now, again, this is 1986. And one of the first things I did was think, that means that sooner or later, this is going to hit the fan. And a New York Times best-selling writer is going to be associated with this story. I need to know more about this Whitley Strieber guy. It wasn't like I could go online and find anything about you. There wasn't a line to go on, but I could read your books. And I read Billy. I read Unholy Fire. I read The Forbidden Zone. And, our work continued, but I think it was come that spring, Bud told me that you were doing better and that your manuscript was done. That understood. One afternoon around this time, I'm home, an apartment I shared on West 57th Street with my sister Helen, and the phone rings. And Peter Robbins, yes, this is Whitley Strieber. Hi, he said. You said, essentially, let me just cut right to it. I know you know what's been going on with me, and I asked Bud. The book has been professionally proofread, the manuscript, but I asked Bud if there was someone I could just have read it, who was very familiar with the scenario and the work, who was an editor and a writer, and somebody who would keep their mouth closed until this was public. And I'd like you to read my manuscript. Well, Whitley, that was, to say I was flattered was an understatement. It was a very exciting moment for me. And of course, I acquiesced and said, yes, send it over. And you said, no, there's one copy and it doesn't leave our home. What I need is for you to tell me the earliest time, the earliest day you can come over our apartment on LaGuardia Place. It was a wonderful apartment too, wasn't it? Just
Oh, it
great.
sure was. And made it so beautiful.
It was fabulous. And your wonderful art collection and that view out the window of the Picasso sculpture.
Yeah. And everything Anne touched became beautiful.
So essentially what you were saying was, come over here some morning as early as you can. We will feed you breakfast. We will put you in our guest room. You will read that book. We will bring you lunch. We will bring you dinner, but you will not leave until you finish it. And then let us know what you think. Well, I thought, count me in. And I think it was the first Saturday after that, I showed up. I got to meet Anne. I got to meet your son. We had a lovely breakfast together. And into the guest room I went. And I think it was 8 or 9 hours, nicely supplied with food and non-alcoholic beverages. And I came out at the end and told you how much I liked it. My only thought was, having gone through years of therapy years earlier, in part to deal with my obsession and my inability to integrate the reality that had come crashing in on me, just with a profoundly life-changing sighting and a sister who was an abductee. And I suggested you might want to just keep working on it a little bit longer. My best sense was that it probably went to the printer the next day, and it did just fine without my suggestions. But it was a very exciting day for me. And you know that feeling of just, this is about to break in the world, and there's going to be this quiet period, but I have now read this manuscript. This book is going to make a huge impression on the world, and Lord knows, did it ever. Were you?
Yeah.
I mean, you had successful books to that point. Had you imagined that this thing would not just be a bestseller here, but worldwide to a degree, and go into translation after translation?
Well, I think it was a bestseller because of the fact that people had had the experience and didn't know it was a real experience until they saw the face.
Yeah.
And that was it. But you know, what happened in those days was so tragic, because I've never known why, but what I did not know is, you're right, the book was published just shortly after you read it. When you read it, I had no idea that that was the case, would be the case. I had no idea. I did not know that the publisher had jumped up the release date and sent the book out to all of the bookstores in boxes without even orders or any sell-in or anything.
Oh, wow.
And I think they did it because they were scared that there was going to be some kind of negative reaction from the government, though no one ever hinted that to me.
I'll be damned.
But it ruined my relationship with Bud, because here I was thinking that our books were going to be published together. He had written Intruders then.
Intruders came out just after that by some weeks, and then, or a month or two.
A month later, I jumped him by a month and he blamed me. And
Yeah.
I had nothing
Yeah.
whatsoever to do with it. And I could never get through to him again until the day he died. And it was very tragic and very sad.
I thought
But
so too. And
what?
I didn't, again, to cut in because Bud was one of my dearest friends, a mentor, and the level of kindness and
I
goodwill.
do. He
It was
was,
so, I remember talking to his agent, Phyllis, who was very frustrated about it. And I don't know if she had the right understanding. Your publisher, Morrow, was a business, and they were looking to strike and do as well as they could using this strategy. But
yeah.
he never understood. And it was something we couldn't talk about either, which made me sad because you're you. And what a
Well,
wonderful ongoing friendship that would have been for both of you.
it would have been very helpful to the whole community if that hadn't happened. But when you were sitting in there reading it on that Saturday morning, what I didn't know is the books were already in the bookstores, in boxes, ready to be uncrated the next Monday morning.
I'll be damned.
I didn't know that.
This was sociological. What a shock. First for the people opening the books, and where's our, invoice for this? And we've got to
Right.
put this out. This cover is really unnerving. I can't imagine how many letters that you got about that cover, because I know that Bud got hundreds. I know that for a fact because I ended up answering a lot of them. Part of my job was to respond to letters, and Bud was old school. Everybody that wrote him got a handwritten note on stationery, even if just to acknowledge receipt. And a number of people wrote to say, "Dear Mr. Hopkins," and you probably got equivalent ones, the being that I saw was reminiscent of the one on the cover, but it didn't have as pointy a chin. Its mouth wasn't as pronounced. It had a smaller nose, and essentially bringing it back to an archetype of a more traditional gray. But for me, that's sort of a BC and AD in UFO publishing, 1987. Your book, Timothy Good's Above Top Secret, which made him somebody I had tremendous respect for from that point on as well. And then Intruders. It was a remarkable year for UFO books.
It really was.
And for the impact on society as a result.
Yeah, it was. Well, I don't know that the picture on the cover of Communion is all that accurate. Bud didn't like it because he said the head wasn't big enough. But I thought that that didn't matter. What did matter were the eyes. And Bud had never, at least he didn't have a conscious memory of it, although I've suspected he was an abductee for a long time. I remembered those eyes. I'm looking at it right now, actually. It's here. Yes.
Oh,
This is
hello.
the original
Is that
picture.
the original?
Yeah.
Oh,
it sure
for
is.
Sakes. Wow.
So, she's here. She's always here. And those eyes in that picture give you the feeling that you get. A small amount of it.
Yeah.
But the feeling of somebody entering you is absolutely foreign to human experience, and it comes out of those eyes.
Did it flow naturally that your next book was going to be a book to follow up on Communion, rather than say, okay, I've done this UFO thing, this other intelligence thing, I think I'm going to write another piece of kind of Gothic fiction like I used to?
Yeah, that's exactly what I plan to do. I had been writing a book about a spy novel about Russia before this happened. And I was planning to go back to it and just go back to my life. But the visitors had other plans, and they started coming back to the cabin, and Anne got involved. And, when Anne got involved, things changed and things happened. And she said, first, all these letters are coming in, and I'm thinking, oh, boy, what are we going to do with all these letters? Because these are very private stories.
Yes.
And they've all got these names and addresses on them, so we can't just toss them.
That's right.
And it was far beyond the ability to answer every letter. It was, thousands of letters, 5,000 or 6,000 letters would come in a day at the beginning. The mailmen would just come in pouring them onto them. And I said, Annie, what are we going to do? And I said, we can't possibly read all these letters. And she said, well, you might not be able to, but I can. And she hired a secretary who she found in the letters, Lori Barnes, who turned out to live right down the street from us and ended up as Anne's secretary for the next 15 years. And they cataloged all the letters, typed up a lot of them. The ones that, were simple, just saying it was very powerful, or, those they did discard, but took the names and kept them separate, of course, cut them off. And, but the ones with a more complex story, they saved. And that's about 30,000 letters, which are now at Rice University in the Authors of the Impossible archive, all because of Anne. And, she knew that this was first contact and that would be important in time.
Yes.
And that's what it is. The letters are the record of first contact. That is the human record of first contact, saved by my wife. But then she also realized that there were people in the letters who were having ongoing experiences. And she said, Whitley, we're going to have people come up to the cabin. And so she started having groups of people up to the cabin, and the visitors showed up. And so, I realized I'm involved in this more deeply than I thought.
You better believe it.
And then I wrote Transformation and Breakthrough. And then it tapered off. There's not so much experience happened after that. And then a few years later, South Park came out with Lampoon of Me, and my rape became a national joke or an international joke. And then people, as I say, people will be glad to buy a book by someone who's controversial, but not by someone who's being laughed at. Not someone who's a joke. So.
How interesting.
We lost the cabin and we lost everything. We ended up in a little condo we owned down in San Antonio where my mother had been living until she passed away. And it was real hard.
That apartment in New York had to be very rough to give up. Also,
my God, you have no idea. We not only had to give up the apartment, we had to give up the beautiful new cabin we had built in upstate New York. We gave everything up and ended up basically in a car driving down to Texas with just a little money left.
The movie version of Communion, I know I was very excited when I learned that a movie would be made, that Chris Walken was going to play you. Chris Walken, for me, is one of our finest actors. I'm proud to be born in Queens, New York, like him. And I would watch him in a dog food commercial. Anything. That had to be something of a rush. And, oh gosh, David Mamet's wife, the wonderful actor, Lindsay Cruz, playing Anne. It seemed like, how could this not be a huge hit? But it was a wonderful movie, but, Hollywood.
Well, what happened here was this. First, you would think that a book like that would be picked up by a big studio. I was given exactly one pitch to Paramount, to the head of production at Paramount, who was being fired and was already on his way out.
Oh, gosh.
That was the only studio pitch I got for the book. And why? Why didn't it go to MGM and to Warner's? And there were a lot of big studios in those days, more than there are now.
Yeah.
Didn't go to anyone except that one guy who was leaving. I heard that Steven Spielberg had been interested in it, but nothing came of it. And I ended up with nothing, and strongly suspected that the government was behind this, and I still do. I think they did it. I think they quashed the movie on purpose. And as they would have quashed the book if they had the chance, if the publisher hadn't pulled the rug out from under them. I mean, they sent FBI agents to my doctors and stuff. They were definitely had an interest, and it wasn't a friendly interest, because I was stepping on their turf. So, and here was this total outlier, total wild card, suddenly in a field that what I didn't know was the most secret thing in the United States.
That's right.
Government. Now we know that.
Yeah.
And I was just we were destroyed. We were destroyed. I've never known. South Park being South Park, those guys probably just dreamed it up on their own. They didn't need to have some CIA guy whisper in their ear. I mean, but it was just played right into the government's hands.
That's right.
And marginalized me, and I'm still basically marginalized. Like there's a big new foundation coming up that a lot of my friends are on the board. I'm never going to be invited onto that board. Not not Whitley Strieber. No one who has worked for the government in the past right now will interview on Dreamland anymore. They've been silenced ever since the David Grush thing happened. Now, I hear, and I hope this is true, that there's going to be another big revelation in October.
Yeah.
I hope that's true, because if it is true, it's got to be about the bodies. I know a hell of a lot about the bodies, but what's the point in me sitting and saying these things, because there's no backup? And I like when I wrote Majestic, I wrote it as a novel, and it's got a lot of novelistic stuff in it. It's not all true.
And a very enjoyable novel too. It was
thank you.
My dad's favorite of your books as well.
Gosh, I love a lot of mine. I liked my books, and I'm sorry that my novel writing career ended, but I don't even have a publisher anymore. I publish myself, because what happens is it's not the publisher's fault. There's no conspiracy.
Sure.
There's this thing called the death spiral, where they sell in a book, say they sell in 25,000 copies, and only 20,000 sell. So the stores send back 5,000 copies. Next book they sell in, they only get 15,000 copies sold in. So the book's not as visible as it was. And then that doesn't sell as well either, because people don't see it. And soon the writer is over. And that happened to me. It took more than 3 books, but it happened to me. And I'm not a factor in the bookstores anymore, and therefore, and also not with the publishers. However, that doesn't mean my books don't sell. They do sell. They sell very well online, thank God. So, go ahead.
We have 8-9 minutes left. I've been thinking I could just not bring this up, but I will. I knew Anne a little. She was a lovely woman, obviously a great mom. You two had a spectacular marriage in so many ways.
Sure did.
And she gets sick and she dies. You have handled this in a way, the losing of the closest person in your life, in a way that has inspired thousands of people and given a lot of people who are in despair a sense of this barrier, this border, this thing that we conceptualize that I'm terrified of or frightened of or makes me so despairing. It's imaginary in a way, and we are as connected or more connected than we ever were, and it goes on.
Yeah. Well, what happened first, back in the old days, Anne came out of her office one day and said, after reading letters, this has something to do with what we call death. And we realized that so many people, and in fact, it happened this way a number of times at the cabin, that the dead would show up in connection one way or another with the visitors, only it was physical at the cabin. It wasn't non-physical. So these dead people were materializing somehow. I held the hand of one of them, for God's sakes, one time. So we were fairly sure that death was not the end. And we made a pact. We were going to, the first one to die would come back to friends, not to the other one, because neither one of us would believe that for a second. And I forgot about the pact entirely. Anne died at 7:15 on 7:25 on August the 15th, 2015. And at 9:30, a friend called and said, Belle Fuller said, "Whitley, is Anne all right? Because I just heard her voice in my ear telling me to call you."
Oh,
and I was sitting in there begging Anne, saying, "Annie, Annie, Annie, if you're still here in any way, please let me know something."
Yeah.
And that was just the first. It took Anne. Anne came back not even 3 hours after she left. She came right back again immediately. And over the next week, it became obvious that she was still there. And it led to the writing of a book, The Afterlife Revolution, which we basically wrote together. And so now my attitude is, we're still together. We just are down to one body. And that's why I wear 2 rings. I wear both of our rings to symbolize the fact that we're still going, but we just have one body.
Not bad, all things considered.
Yeah, well, she did a hell of a lot in this world. She made the communion thing happen. She turned it into something that was useful and practical for people.
Yes.
She made the book happen. She was the one who titled the book. And then after she passed away, she showed conclusively, in my opinion, that there is an afterlife. That woman, the great human being, one of the real great human beings.
Whitley, do you think there's a connection between the afterlife, life and death, and truly anomalous other intelligences that come and go with impunity that you've dealt with?
Of course. We are hiding in a corner of the room, mankind is, and shining bright lights on ourselves so we don't have to look out in the shadows. But the shadows is where everybody ends up, and it's where we will go to. We will belong. We belong there as well. The veil between the living and the dead is an illusion within us, and the visitors don't have that veil. They don't even have the concept of death. When they lose a body, it's more like losing scuba gear. It pisses them off, but that doesn't mean that they're dead. And you know we are independent souls. I'm not sure if we're eternal or not, but we are living in the body as if this was the beginning, end, and middle of life. But it is only an incident in a much, much longer journey that each of us is on. And Anne is still on that journey in a lot of very amazing and surprising ways. She's back as a child, and she's also the soul is still in contact with me. One of the first things she said after she passed away was, "Whitty, I'm not Anne anymore, but I will always be Anne for you." So when this extraordinary soul comes to me, it feels like it's Anne. And when I'm with the little child that is the soul has raised up in the world again, it doesn't feel like Anne, but we're very, very close, me and that child.
Yeah. Whitley Strieber, it has been first wonderful to reconnect with you. I think the last time we
Yeah,
saw each
Peter,
other
it is good.
was you and I and Anne and Steve Greer were in a panel discussion moderated by Yvonne Smith on abductions at International UFO Congress in Laughlin. And bang, the years go by. At some point, may I ask you to rejoin us, either just you and I or as part of a panel on a future episode of Meanwhile Here on Earth?
Sure.
Great.
I'm going abroad to write another book.
I have heard through the grapevine, and I will say no more.
Yeah.
Much success and enjoy the change of location. And
Yeah, it's helpful.
we'll be in touch. Stay well, my friend, and really
You
a pleasure
too.
getting to spend this evening with you.
It's always a pleasure, and it's a joy to be with everybody. And I really enjoyed reading all of your comments as we went along. It was good.
Outstanding.
We're basically good people. The government might not like us, but we like us.
On that note, Peter Robbins with my special guest, Whitley Strieber. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. We'll see you next week, same time, same station.